Welcome to the Humans Against Poor Scholarship Summer Grant interviews. Each one of our interviewees is competing for a $2,000 grant to help fund their summer research. Do you want to have a say in who gets funded? Become a HAPS donor today by visiting www.hapsfund.com/donate. Hello everybody and welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. We have another interview-packed weekend, and this weekend we are talking about Egyptology, people who work on the periphery of Egyptology, and it's going to be amazing and wonderful. So without further ado, we are going to have our first applicant. Hello Bet, how are you?
Hello Megan, lovely to see you again. Hi everyone, thanks for having me.
If you have not met Bet before, everybody, we interviewed her last year, I think, sometime.
Yes.
About her dissertation
research.
Last year,
just after the George Floyd protests started.
Yes, I remember that. So if you like what you hear, go back. There's a whole hour-long interview with Bet about a wide variety of topics, primarily her research, and it was a lovely conversation. So we are going to do the HAPS interviews, which is short and sweet and very much to the point. So could you introduce yourself and tell us where you're currently studying?
Hello everyone, my name is Bet. I am originally from California, but I am doing my PhD at Heidelberg University in Germany. But my research is focused in Rome and Florence, so I'm in Florence right now.
Oh, lovely. I'm glad you've been able to travel a little bit.
Oh, no, I moved here because of the
pandemic. Okay. Oh.
I didn't have a choice if I wanted to keep working on my PhD, so pandemic move for the win.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad you've been able to keep working. How did you get into your field?
I had quite a roundabout route, actually. I started my undergrad intending to become a cardiac surgeon. No one in my family went to college, and there was a lot of pressure to do what are like sort of the typical high success jobs. Teacher, doctor, lawyer were sort of the known options, let's say, what you could do with a college degree. I did 2 years of undergraduate doing biochemistry, and it was soul-sucking, to be honest, doing something that was that contrary to everything that I was interested in doing. And I took some other classes, took a semester off and took some other classes afterward. And one of the classes made us work in the anthropology museum associated with campus. And they actually allowed us to touch and deal with and help mount ancient objects in some of their displays. So I was dealing with an Egyptian cat mummy for the first time, hands-on, as an undergraduate. And I didn't even know that museum curator was like a job that you could have at the time. And so I spent the next 10 years basically trying to work my way back to graduate school, did my master's here in Italy in museum studies. And then now I'm working my way through the 4th year of my PhD in the hopes of working toward curation.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. What are your specific research interests?
So as a master's degree student, I started working on Emperor Hadrian's collection of Egyptian and Egyptian style materials at his palace at Tivoli. And it made me realize that there's really not a ton of great work done to put everything that was with those materials back together as one whole assemblage. There's a lot of text about it, but there aren't any sort of visualizations of the objects themselves, not just the architecture. So what I'm working on for my PhD is doing a database of these Egyptian and Egyptian style objects so that I can analyze them by material, place of origin, etc. To talk about ideas of authenticity and whether authenticity was in any way a factor in the Roman mind when it came to Egyptian displays and materials. And I'm looking at putting all of these objects back together through 3D models. Basically, if you go to any of the major museums, even though the Roman and like the Greco-Roman style objects were found in some of the same spaces as these Egyptian and Egyptian style objects, and even though many of them were made in Rome or nearby, they're displayed in different parts of the museum, so you don't get to see everything together, let alone in its original space. So my goal is to put these assemblages back together digitally so that we can do walkthroughs, and then to print 3D models so that people, especially people who don't have access to like some of the 3D modeling programs, et cetera, can look at it on display and touch it and move pieces around and see how light changes objects in the space, et cetera.
That's fantastic. What kinds of objects are we talking about?
So the class of material in general is what's known as Egyptiaca Romana, and that's basically things that are made in Egypt or in Roman Egyptian style. The class itself can contain anything from like small jewelry pieces to colossal statuary. But since I'm looking at 4 specific sites, and these sites are primarily places where there's a strong link to worship or veneration of deities or household gods. So in that case, you're mostly looking at things like small and large statuary, oil lamps, sort of objects used in veneration, processionals, like canopic jars made out of marble that don't actually have a cavity in the middle. It's just a fake marble version. But also like really enormous Herm statues of sort of Antinous Osiris that are now in the Vatican Museum. They're made of red granite. They're like 18 feet tall. So there's quite a range of material and typology. And that leaves out, of course, what did not survive. We don't know how much might have been printed on fabrics or put in like smaller, like wooden or straw or linen papyrus. We don't have the remains of many of those things.
Mm-hmm. And what 4 sites are you looking at?
So I am looking at 2 sort of wealthy villas in Tivoli, the Hadrian's Villa and what's now known as the Villa di Cassio. I'm looking at the Iseum Campense, which is a big temple complex dedicated to Isis and Serapis in Rome. And I am looking at a small lararium that is now demolished, but was on the Esquiline Hill. And we have very precise archaeological drawings from before they knocked it down to build an extension of a rich person's house in the 1700s, I think. And all the statues are still in the Capitoline Museum.
Fantastic. And would these have been primarily domestic spaces or public spaces?
So that's the interesting thing. The lararium, for example, it's the size of a niche, it's the size of a large closet. So basically family members and people very close to the family would have been admitted, but it's essentially a private closed space. Whereas the Iseum Campense, the temple grounds are sort of open to the public, and there are places within the temple that are curtained off where the mysteries happen and the general public can't enter and can't even see in. Only initiates can go. So it's a combination public-private space, as are the 2 larger villas, which would have been used for conducting business. Hadrian's Villa in particular, he basically used it as his summer residence. So he's conducting all the business of empire from there, and they could have had thousands of people there at any given time. So there's quite a lot of publicity happening, even though it's technically a private home.
And you said that at the moment these Egyptianizing objects are displayed separately to the Greco-Roman materials. In antiquity, they would have been housed, like mingled together and viewed in one frame, as it were.
Yes. For example, at the Villa di Cassio, we know that the objects that were found that are quote unquote Egyptianizing, which are colored marble statues, were found in the same places as the statues of the muses that are now in the Room of the Muses at the Vatican, which is sort of these 9 enormous, like larger than life statues of these women. They were displayed alongside these much smaller statues that are now largely fragmented, some of which are in the Museo del Prado in Madrid. So those things would have been together, and they're near a space where there was an enormous mosaic. Probably the mosaic is now in the National Museum of Wales, but it takes up what is essentially the floor plan for an apartment for one person. It's a very large mosaic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And those were all within the same sort of, similar areas. So you're traveling between them visually connecting them in your mind as you go through a space.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. What are your specific plans for this coming summer, and how do you think HAPS funding will help you with them?
Well, I have a US passport and I am currently in Europe doing research, but my stipend has ended and they won't extend it even though COVID has obviously changed a lot of the situation. So I'm having to extend the time frame of my PhD by a semester, but I'm not allowed to legally work here and I don't have family support. So I'm doing online gig work as much as I can, editing and translation work. But the $2,000 would allow me to actually finish my 3D models and database, and to pay for the pro level of software to put everything together so I can do the walkthroughs, and to pay rent and food money. So that would be fantastic. And if I had any extra money, I would be using it for photo permissions from the Museo del Prato in the Vatican, because sometimes photos can go for up to $200 each and you're not permitted to use your own.
Yeah, I've run into similar problems with the British Museum. Photos are very expensive and
Yes.
kind of essential for this kind of research work. When you're dealing with physical objects, you need the photos. So
Yes.
well, hopefully we can help you with that. We have a question from the audience. Zebra says he sees from your thesis that you have a creative side. I came, I saw, I borrowed. Does this sort of creativity help in the scholastic process? I ask because I sometimes used to see my own essays marked with "Where did you get this?" when I added my own thoughts.
Well, the fun thing about the "where did you get this" question is each "where did you get this" question can be a paper on its own if you have the time and energy, and then you can self-cite. I'm not at that point yet in my career, but there are a lot of people who do that. I love to be creative. What I do in my summers is I work on excavations, but I don't dig. I work on ceramic. So I clean and label and try to reassemble ceramics. I love puzzles. It's my favorite thing. I'm a very crafty person. I'm not a very artsy person. So I can draw really technical detailed drawings of a site or a piece of pottery, very linear, very precise, very measured. But ask me to draw a human and you will get a stick figure. That's the best I can do.
Nice.
So yes, I like to do design work, and that's why this is part of why I love curation and 3D modeling, because it lets me be artistic without having to actually draw things.
I'm the exact opposite. I can't draw a technical, detailed plan to save my life, but I can do people. We do not have any more audience questions. So do you have anything that you'd like to elaborate on in the last couple of minutes?
Sure. I'd like to talk a little bit about the way we think about ancient identity and the way that people relate to objects in the ancient world. A lot of the things that I read or see, or the things that I was taught, especially at the high school level, but also at the university level, puts people and objects together in spaces that interpret the objects in only one dimension. So this is a religious statue, therefore it is a religious object, and that is the only aspect of approach. You don't get a lot of people might just like it. It's beautiful. So I want to emphasize the point that ancient people have really complex inner lives the same as we do. I like to use the example of a Renaissance painting of Mary that hung in the room of one of the Medici wives here, that, you know, we don't know how she felt about it. She might have loved it because it's a painting of Mary and a child and it related her to her own child, or because it's a religious painting, or because it's super fancy and she wanted to show it off, or because she wanted to sponsor the artist, or because it was a gift, or any and all of those things all together. It went with the decor of the room. I mean, there are just so many approaches that we can take to it. And we should apply that level of context and nuance to the way ancient people relate to objects too, especially in religious contexts.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. A very thoughtful answer. I am going to let you go and get on with the rest of your afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us, Bet.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, everybody, that was the wonderful Bet Hux. Again, if you are interested in what she was talking about, we have a longer interview with her from last year, almost a full year ago, actually. So go and have a look for that. I am going to put up the holding screen for a couple of minutes while we wait for our next guest. And welcome back, everybody. We have applicant number 2 with us, so we will just get started. Hello, thank you so much for joining us. Oh, I cannot hear you. Oh, and you can't hear me either. Okay, 1 second, everybody. Let's just work on getting this audio working. We always have technical difficulties. That's why we have a 5-minute buffer built around each interview. So we will just work on getting Nora back so that we can hear each other, and then we will get to the interview. Hopefully it will work. I have to say, we've been doing pretty well. This is weekend 3 of interviews. This is the first time we've had major audio concerns. So, fingers crossed. Can you all hear me, just to check? I've not muted myself somehow. Okay, Nora, hello. Can you hear me now? No. And I can't hear you. Oh, gracious me. Okay. If this doesn't work, everyone, I'm just going to get a Zoom window up and we will just stream through Zoom for a few minutes. Sorry for the delay. Thank you all for your patience. This is how you know it is live. Do, do, do. Do, do, do. Nora is just trying a different browser.
Good.
Yes, there we go.
Sorry.
Oh, no, please don't worry. We have an extra 5 minutes built in for this kind of thing. That's absolutely not a problem. Not a problem in the slightest. So could we get started? Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you're from?
Yes, my name is Nora Shawi. I am Egyptian. I'm an Egyptian archaeologist. I am currently based in Cairo, Egypt, which is where I'm from, but I was born in the States. So basically, yeah, my research interests are, I'm an archaeologist, so I excavate in Egypt. And the area where I choose to excavate is a bit different. It's the Delta, so it's up north in Egypt, rather than, you know, like the Valley of the Kings and all the royal tombs you hear about in the media and stuff. So my research interests are a bit different. I focus on settlements. So basically it's where the daily lives of average people like me and you. I decided to focus on that during my master's. I decided to shift the focus from the royals, because I kept thinking, why is all the research just focused on, you know, one part of ancient Egyptian history? And it's just like focusing on, you know, in modern times, if you think about it, like our governments and our presidents, and just, you know, think that the majority of the people think the same way, which of course is not true. So I decided, I was very curious about what the daily lives of normal people were living like, and what did they really worship? What were they thinking? So with that, I decided to focus on the Delta because my research is focused on late period ancient Egypt. So that's the very end of the Pharaonic Empire, because I'm more interested in what led to the demise of such an intense empire. It's very long and it was very solid for a really long time. And the government was constantly expanding. So I thought it was interesting to understand how that ended somehow, and it wasn't abrupt. So my work is all up north in the Delta, and it's difficult because basically this area it's very rural in Egypt. So in Cairo, I live, it's more in the middle, so it's very overly populated as a capital city. Up north, extremely populated, a very rural area. It's where agricultural fields are. So this is where a lot of people make their income. And the problem is they're living on top of the archaeological sites where we're working on right now. So there's an urgency to really excavate there because it really will not exist in the next 30 years. So this is really important. It's something I've really been fighting for since I started excavating, and I've luckily been able to receive a few grants from National Geographic to excavate in these areas that really won't exist very soon. So that in itself is a reason to preserve our history. So up in the Delta is where I track different sites from the late period to identify where they are and when did they shift according to the different Nile branches. So the Nile branch had multiple branches back then, and now most of them have dried up. So that's now what we're realizing, that where the ancient sites were living all around those ancient branches. So it's a bit difficult to track things that aren't there anymore. Mm-hmm. With also the fact that people are living on these sites and encroaching them every year. So every time I return back to my sites, people are building stuff. Like 2 years ago, they built a football field over one summer. So it's things like that really make it's very urgent, to excavate in these areas. So that's mainly my main research. And I also excavate in Sudan. It's also an interest of mine, to focus on settlements and as well as military fortresses.
Fantastic, thank you. And someone said in the chat, and I have to say I agree wholeheartedly with them, that we don't hear enough about ordinary people in history.
Totally.
So this is most definitely important work that needs doing. How many sites do you track?
The ones I excavate at currently is around 3 or 4. It's hard, and during Corona, obviously, it went declined. But then the other sites, I do it just based on research and the other people that I know that are excavating in the Delta. Right now, in the last 10 years or 10, 15 years, it really picked up. The focus into the Delta. So a lot of research is coming out, a lot of publications. So that helps my research a lot. And I know a lot of people in the field who actually work there. I know them personally, so it helps with my research. And people are they're kind enough to share their results even before they're published. So it helps me track down different sites.
Wonderful. And was the Nile Delta very heavily populated during this time period?
Yeah. So it's important because especially in the late period where I'm studying, there was a shift, a power struggle in ancient Egypt. And, it was between the kings, the royal kings, and the priests. The priests ended up taking over a lot. They were controlling all the temples, all the religious cults. So a part of my research is about kingship and cult, and that versus government regulation, and what really, did they actually use religion as, just a tool, or was it a genuine worship or a belief during that time? And there's, you can't just pay attention to propaganda that's all over the temple walls and the tomb walls. That's just all done on purpose, even though it's extremely interesting and very aesthetically pleasing. But there's so much more behind the scenes, and it's so much more complex than people think. I find it fascinating. But that's basically what I'm trying to understand, the difference between the two. So the priests were running the country from the south, from where you basically Luxor, Aswan, and then up north is where late period kings shifted, and that's actually where they were from. They were born up there. So they shifted the government to be the hub, to be up in the north. So the Delta was extremely important at one point of time. Right now, if you look at today, the rural areas, when I'm digging, my workmen are from there, and they have no idea that they're from royal cities. But it's because right now they don't look like that. They're so damaged and not preserved that a lot of them are used as trash dumps. And these were like, it's crazy to believe like that there were huge temples here, colossal statues. In the late period, they tried to revive the Old Kingdom artistic principles, and the Old Kingdom was, the top level of advancement in ancient Egypt. And ever since then, it kind of declined, and we lost that knowledge, and no one knows how or why.
Mm-hmm.
So late period kings were trying to revive that and looked up to the Old Kingdom as, something they wanted to be like them. So they commissioned a lot of colossal statues to be done at that time, and that cost a lot of money for that time with the government, and there was famine in the country, but they still focused on making the people know that they're secure, they're solid, that we're being invaded by multiple entities, and it doesn't matter, we are Egyptian and we're strong, and we're
not going anywhere.
Yeah, even though we did get invaded eventually, but still it was the effort of really making everyone believe that this is what we are solidified.
Thank you very much. And when you're looking at non-royal, non-governmental kind of archaeology, domestic archaeology, what kinds of evidence do you have to work with?
That's what I find the most interesting. I mean, a lot of people ask me what's the coolest thing you've ever found or whatever. And domestic structures, it's fascinating because it's not as obvious as, a gilded gold royal coffin or all of that, but you find a lot of interesting things in the domestic structures, really how they lived. You see the outlines of their homes and how similar it actually is to the people who are living there today in those areas, which is quite interesting. You find a lot of amulets, religious amulets, that tells us a lot about which gods they were worshiping in each area. So every site I work at really has their main deity, and then the other ones are just reincarnated over time. But you can really see what they adapted to in that area, and then it makes you think, why were they focused really on the cat goddess or Hathor or Bastet, whatever. So, and these sites are relatively close to each other. So you can see that something has transformed in these sites, and what they're really like. It's becoming an obsession in these areas, because all of the domestic structures end up having the same exact amulets. And some, you can see how they domesticated animals, such as cats and dogs. So that's interesting to find them sometimes buried or mummified underneath their homes, because they couldn't afford to have a proper burial, like a royal burial or ones for the elites or nobles. So you would find stuff like that, and also a couple bodies that are not mummified because I also could not afford it. So it's just kind of seeing a glimpse into the past of what people were kind of like and what they would wear. You would find remnants of clothing, also difficult to find perfectly preserved, but very cool to find, to see what they kind of looked like.
That's really, really cool. What are your particular plans for this summer, and how do you think HAPS funding will be able to help with that?
So my summer is all over the place because of Corona, a lot of things got pushed. So I had a lot of excavations in this last year that keep getting pushed because of security issues, and half of the missions are people coming from abroad, my colleagues, so that's also difficult. So now, thankfully, the permits are all approved, and my upcoming plans are to excavate. I have 2 back-to-back excavations in June and July. June is one in Saqqara. So that is directed by Dr. Ramadan Hussein. He's an Egyptian, and he also works with National Geographic, and it's called the Sayat Tombs Project. So this is also a late period focused excavation, which is why I find it very interesting, because some of the kings from this dynasty and the royals chose to be buried in Saqqara, not in the Delta where they were ruling from. So this is one of my main research questions for my PhD, is to why would they? It doesn't make sense to the normal events that has happened, the pattern in Egyptian history. So that's something I'm really excited to be joining. And also in July, hopefully, another excavation in Tel Tamai. I've been working there for over 7 years, maybe. It's in the Delta next to Mansoura. It's a capital city in Egypt. And that site's a Greco-Roman site. I've been working there a lot for a few years. It's a huge settlement. It's an extremely rich site with what it has. It has one of the largest perfume factories in ancient Egypt during Cleopatra's time. The most recent thing I've been working on there is a fortress that's very close to the edge of the site. So it's really glued to the agricultural fields. So that's my main focus, because it's really, I don't even know if it's going to be completely there when I go back in July. So that's my main focus. Usually the sites that are, encroached and really in danger, those are the ones I want to be attentive to the most, because the most we could do as archaeologists is, document and excavate the things while we can, and to publish and preserve the history. If we don't document anything, then what we're doing isn't any better than the looters. So to document everything is really the most important thing. And then once it's gone forever. So there's not much we can do. So that's my main focus for those 2 months. And in the middle of that, I'm also supposed to finish my PhD this year. So
congratulations.
Thank you. I'm sure most people know the writing stage is, I'm at the end crackdown stage. So I'm doing my PhD. It's a joint PhD between Cairo University and Durham University, where I did my master's. So I'm also supposed to go for 2-3 weeks to complete my final research with my advisor there, Dr. Penelope Wilson, and really finalize my whole thesis. So after the summer, I can come back and defend it in Cairo in September. Hopefully.
Well, that is a very full summer, and
I know.
I wish you the best of luck. That all sounds amazing.
Thank you. So the funding would help me juggle all of these things at once. I mean, either the flights to Durham or the transportation between the excavations and tools for that. So, I mean, a bunch of different things. But hopefully I can get everything done. I think it's better to have a lot of work than not any work. So
I would agree with you there.
The best case.
We have a couple of questions before I let you go. So Zebra is asking, how difficult is it to do research in Egypt and the Sudan these days? I sometimes think my country, I assume the United States, has weird political problems plus COVID, but in the Sudan, that sounds like an astonishing challenge. Is it difficult to get permissions?
Oh my God, yeah. Permissions are the worst thing. It's so political here. It's so bureaucratic. For my first excavation ever, when I got my National Geographic grant, I was dubbed as too young by the Ministry of Antiquities here, the government, and I was 25. So I don't think it's too young at all. Or they assumed I was unqualified or underqualified because I was a woman and I was too young and not a doctor yet. So I faced these things a lot, and being Egyptian does not help. People think that as well, that foreigners, might have it tougher than Egyptians. I did not find it the case at all. It still brought it against me even more, my age and my gender the most. But besides that, besides the permissions with the government, actually excavating on the sites, I had no problems whatsoever. The types of people you work with are extremely kind. Rural areas, they're in remote villages, so they're so nice. It's the government that's always, an issue in any country. Sudan was much easier to get permissions, surprisingly. For Egyptians, I found it much easier. Excavating there is difficult as well. I mean, the delta is difficult to excavate because it's very hard, the ground. It's not vast amounts of sand. So it's very difficult to excavate mud brick in soil. Sudan, very deep shafts. 3 times the tomb shafts had collapsed on me and my team. Wow. So there's things like that happen. I was actually in Sudan when Corona hit the world. I was there excavating, and it was in the news saying it hit Sudan, and no one knew what it was really. And I got out that week, and then there was a lockdown in Egypt when I came here. So, wow. You get stuck in all these things when you're in remote areas, but it's definitely difficult sometimes to excavate in these areas.
Thank you. And we have one more question from Zebra. I get the impression that amulets or icons were sometimes buried as part of a ritual, not just abandoned or lost. Is this correct, or just an impression?
100%. We find them in the domestic structures. Usually you find them, they're abandoned or lost. In tombs, you find them, they're done on purpose. You find them wrapped on, when we do CT scans on the mummies, you find the amulets actually, and they're put in certain places, like it's very on purpose. It is not just done by accident and got lost in the mix with the tools. No, they're put on the chest, and then the lower, a bit lower than the chest as well. They're done in certain areas where the amulets are there for protection and, you know, to take you into the afterlife. So definitely there was a purpose for everything in ancient Egypt. Like most of, like I would say 99% of things, they were not an accident. Everything was done with purpose. So it's a very complex history to research.
Well, Nora, it's been a delight talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well,
and we'll be in
so
touch, of course, in touch in a couple of weeks.
Great. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, that was Nora, and that was fascinating. I always say that after every interview, that was fascinating. It's true. All of the research is very interesting. And we are running a little bit behind, so we're just going to go straight on to our final interview of this morning. Good morning. How are you?
Hi, how are you? Great to meet you.
Very good. Thank you. Could you introduce yourself and tell us where you're currently studying?
Sure. My name is Sika Peterson, and I am a PhD student at the University of Alcalá in Madrid, in Spain. So quite a bit away from you guys.
Thank you. So how did you get into your field?
Oh, I wanted to learn how to read hieroglyphs, and I had no idea. Yeah, I had no idea where or what or how to do that. So I just went online and said, how to read hieroglyphs, what to do. And then it turned out that I could actually study it in Copenhagen, where I lived at the time, in Denmark, at the university. So I thought, okay, great. And then this whole new world opened up for me, the world of Egyptology. I had no idea that was so fascinating a field, and I really got bit by it, so to speak. So this fascination with hieroglyphs just kept me going on into this field, and now I'm here doing a PhD. It's amazing.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
What are your own personal research interests?
Sorry, I couldn't hear that.
What are your personal research interests?
I have up until now used the time to spend the time to go into the administrative parts of Egyptology in the what the period we call the New Kingdom. So it's about a 500-year period from 2050 BC to about 1650 BC. No, that's not true. The 1550 BC to 1069. I still have a lot to learn, apparently. And I have focused on how they organized their societies. So how they managed the work, what kind of laws were there, how did they manage the salaries and stuff like that. So really the administrative parts so far. And I've actually also been spending a lot of time figuring out how the shipyards, the dockyards worked. Because that was a big part of the Egyptian life, using the Nile and everything like that. And that has been really, really interesting and fascinating and very enlightening work, I must say. So that has been the research up until now.
Mm-hmm. What kinds of evidence do we have for the administrative framework?
Oh, there are a lot, actually, much more than you would maybe think, because basically people have, or the public maybe think that it's all funerary and religious aspects, but there are very, very many administrative papyri. Excuse my language, I'm not a native English speaker.
You're doing just fine.
Thank you. So there are, especially from the New Kingdom, there are a lot of papyri from letters from governments, officials writing to each other, and also workers, workmen. There are work lists of how things were paid out, who got what, and who were on duty this day and why not on this day, and so forth. And there are a lot of receipts from traded objects and stuff like that. So all these kind of things. Also wills and testaments for people with their property, showing who gets what when I die and stuff like that, and marriage contracts and all these different kinds of papyri and limestone fragments, writing tablets, really a lot, an abundance of information.
Thank you. And can I ask, what made you decide to take the administrative path?
Yeah, it could seem a bit dry maybe, but I love mathematics and the administrative parts of my own life. I love the economy and love to be organized in everything I do. So I guess that's just a natural vibe for me to explore further and to see how did they actually do it at the beginning of time, so to speak, and how much did this differ, and how far along were they on this aspect of life as well.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. And it doesn't seem necessarily dry, but it's with Egypt, so much of you're right, so much of what we see is the funerary complexes and the religion. So getting into like the nuts and bolts of how people actually lived, must be fascinating and really not something we hear a lot about.
No, exactly. And that's, of course, also an aspect of why it was interesting to me, because this was a field that wasn't explored as much as the funerary rituals. So for me, that was much more cutting edge, so to speak. And I felt that I could become someone who could also contribute something new to the field by doing it in this area.
No, that's very, very valuable work. Whereabouts do these records come from?
They come from different parts of Egypt and different periods of time in Egypt. We have a lot of limestone fragments from the village of Deir Medina near Thebes or Luxor, modern Luxor, and they have been found in or what's it called in English, the waste dumps. Yeah. Okay. So of course they've been used, but then they have probably been copied over on papyri. These are limestone fragments I'm talking about. So there were a lot of limestone fragments available in the area, because this was the area where a lot of kings were buried, and they were buried in the mountains. So a lot of easy access limestone fragments were there. So they wrote on this, and then when they were done with it, they just tossed it. So they were just actually left on the floor or the ground, so to speak. So it's that way they have been preserved, because they haven't been destroyed, and also they have been preserved because they're of stone and not papyri or anything else that might have deteriorated. So basically that's where we have the most of the information. But also sometimes people leave these things in their tombs. We're not exactly sure why, because it seems an odd place to store your administrative work or documents. But we have found a lot of these in chests, wooden chests, where people have maybe used them for storage, because sometimes they reuse the tombs. So that's a theory anyway, that the tombs were used to store things that needed to be dry and hidden, of course. So maybe that's also an explanation. So that's basically where we have all the stuff that has been preserved.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. What are your plans for the summer, and how do you think HAPS funding will help you?
Oh, yes, that's the interesting part here. So for my current PhD project, I am looking into texts written on coffins, so funerary practices. And many of these coffins that I need to use are in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. But a lot of these are so fragile that they are not being studied. And they were actually also so fragile already when they came into the museum over a century ago. So basically they were stored on shelves up against walls and then covered with these glass plates that were sealed. So now nobody goes in, nobody can work with this, because they are afraid that the preservation state might be worse by using it. So this is a problem, of course, especially for me, because I want to study these coffins, but I can't do it. So luckily, before these coffins were stored away, they were photographed. And these photographs were in a collection that is now in Oxford in England. And I have been given permission to study these photographs, which is an amazing opportunity for me. But, and here is where HAPS can help me, I need to go to Oxford physically because the collection is, of course, not digitalized because it's too expensive for the institutions and it's too time consuming anyway. So I would use the scholarship to travel to Oxford and stay there for a month. In July is the plan for now. And then be able to realize this project, because as it is now, I am really stuck. So this scholarship would make a world of difference to me. So I could actually begin to see what I have in my mind and my theories. So actually it just would be so helpful. And now it seems like a good time to do, because the COVID-19 situation in England seems to be letting up. So the museums and institutions should be be ready to opening up in July if they stick to the plan. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. So when you say they've been photographed, have they photographed the interior contents or just the exterior of the coffins?
Yeah, so the coffins have 6 sides, or 12 actually, because they have 6 outer sides and 6 inner sides. And these were all photographed more or less at the time of arrival. But that's of course only if all of the coffin was preserved. So as good as they could, they photographed all of these. And of course, the photographs are not the high quality that we're used to today, because they're over 100 years old. But they're good enough so I can, if I can read the hieroglyphs, actually work with them. Yeah. So that's how they did it.
Fantastic, thank you. We have a couple of audience questions before I let you go. As Deborah said, do the hieroglyphs represent sounds? And then, do the sounds form words in an Egyptian language? Also, please let Miss Peterson know her accent is lovely.
Oh, thank you. Phew. About that. So yeah, this is a complex question, because hieroglyphs are used in very many different ways, and they do represent sounds sometimes, but more often than not, they're representing ideas, abstract ideas. So that's why they use these depictions instead of real letters that we're used to today. So they are representing the world, the Egyptian world, and the world according to the Egyptians. So more than actual sounds in words. So even though we can read it today, we can't actually know how it sounded like, because that knowledge is lost due to the time that has passed. But we know a bit from the Coptic language. We can trace back some of the sounds. But that is also a theory, because we don't have anyone alive today to know, to be able to verify this. But we think that some of the sounds, when some of the depictions are used together, we know some of the specific sounds. But of course, this is only conjecture.
We can't go back and ask them, am I saying this right?
No, I hope that was enough for the question.
That was beautiful, thank you. And Dr. Osiris says, do you know if they will be using CT scans or something for the actual coffins to have a look at them more closely?
Yes, this is also interesting, because some of the coffins that are not in the Egyptian museum but are in other museums around the world, they are better to work with. They're more free to work with, because also they have better equipment in these parts of the world. So some of the coffins have actually been CT scans, and they have revealed a lot of interesting things. Sometimes the coffin was reused, and you can't see that unless you CT scan it. So that's been a really great experience to see. And also sometimes the way the coffins were manufactured can be revealed this way, because you don't want to split the coffin. So this way you can actually see how they were done. So the craftsmanship of it can also be studied this way, which is really, really helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. You have approximately 3 minutes left. If there's anything else you'd like to share with us.
Oh, there's so many things we could go into. I guess I want to say that I have been studying this for about a year now, and even though I haven't been able to the actual coffins, I have been able to get to some of the texts, which has been revealing so far, because I've seen that there's some texts that are meant for only outer coffins, and some texts only inner coffins, and there are patterns to discover and to trace, and I am very hopeful that once I get to the actual material, that I will be able to get something more substantial to the public and to my field. So I really, really hope that this goes through, because I'm really happy about studying this. I'm so excited.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for coming and talking to us.
Thank you very much.
And I'll be in touch in a couple of weeks.
Sure. Have a great day.
You too, Sika.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay. And you're all surprised I'm going to say this. Another fascinating interview. I had no idea that ancient Egyptians reused coffins. So that was very interesting. And someone actually had a question for me. Jacques and Zebra both want to know what are the eligibility criteria for the HAPS scholarships. We're not terribly strict. You must be a current PhD student enrolled at a university studying some aspect of the ancient Near East. So that can include Egyptology, biblical studies, art history of the region, Mesopotamia, Assyriology, Near Eastern archaeology. Any of that is absolutely fine. We do also have people working in kind of later periods than I would normally consider ancient Near East, but we let them through anyway, because we don't specify a particular time period you must work in. But really the important thing is that you are a current PhD student. We are not taking any more applications for this summer. Applications closed last month, and we had 56 applicants, and I think that's honestly quite enough to be going on with. But we will be reopening applications next February or March, and all the information should be on the HAPS website, which is hapsfund.com. It'll tell you all about who we are, what we do, and there's a menu option called Apply, and that will tell you roughly when you can expect applications to open. We also announce it on Twitter and Facebook, and it goes around the Egyptological listserv and the Assyriological listserv. So we try and publicize it as widely as we can. Yes, so that is HAPS and the eligibility criteria. We have one more interview that I actually recorded last week that I'm going to try and play now, just to make sure we keep all the Egyptology stuff together. So if you have seen this particular interview, if you were here last week for that interview, feel free to go and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Otherwise, this is Jacqueline. She was lovely, and I'm going to try and work out how this will work. So bear with me for 1 second. So without further ado, here is Jacqueline. Hi, Jacqueline. How are you?
Hello, I'm great. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Would you mind, before we get started properly, just giving us a bit of an introduction to yourself and how you got into your field?
Sure. So my name is Jacqueline Huviler, or Jacqueline Huiler if you live in America. I've been told to say my name both ways. So I am an Egyptology doctorate student at the University of Basel in Switzerland, and I have basically been studying Egyptology my whole life. It's a long story, but it started when I was 8 and never stopped. So here I am.
Excellent. I always love it when people say, well, I've just been doing this forever because when I was a kid, it was really interesting and I never really stopped. I think that resonates with an awful lot of people. Okay, would you like to get started and give us just a bit of background about what your research is on?
Sure. So my research is actually looking at the Near East and Egypt and what I like to call intercultural interactions or culture contact between the two regions. Specifically, I am looking at the Late Bronze Age, or relatively equivalent to the Egyptian New Kingdom, which is roughly 1550 to 1069 BCE. Specifically, I am looking at the Near Eastern goddess Anat. She is a hunter goddess. She is a warrior goddess, and she mainly appeared in the ancient Near Eastern city of Ugarit in Syria. She was very prominent there in the Ugaritic Baal cycle. She later made her way into Egypt. And what happened was, during the New Kingdom of Egypt, around 1550 to 1069 BCE, as I said, Egypt was interacting on a supposedly much larger scale with the Near East than it had been prior. There were multiple accounts of immigrants coming over, multiple accounts of immigrant communities being set up. Near Eastern gods started to be worshipped within Egypt itself. There were actually 6 gods. Those are Horon, Reshep, Anat, Kadesh, Baal, and Astarte. My goddess Anat, she made her way into Egypt the very first time, from what my resources show, around 1895 BCE in the 12th dynasty. Basically what I'm doing is I'm looking at Anat and all of the evidence that we have of her interactions and her appearance within Egypt, and using that as a tool to better understand 3 main research questions, which are: how and why did Near Eastern deities find a foothold in Egypt? Why was she so popular? What made her so interesting to the Egyptian community that they would adopt and start worshiping a foreign deity when they already have so many warrior deities of their own? How interactions with the Near Eastern cultural other, and how did that impact late Bronze Age Egyptian identities of themselves? And how did Near Eastern people understand themselves in relation to migration and their new place within Egypt? So it's both anthropological and Egyptological. It's a little bit Near Eastern. And all of this comes together to basically show that culture contact has been happening for long before we could say, yeah, it's been happening for generations. And this is something that, yeah, I think is very important to be able to fully understand Egypt. We need to understand how the Egyptians saw themselves in relation to other people.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I have like a very brief background in Egyptology. My undergraduate was ancient history, which was like everything: classics, Egyptology, Assyriology. If it was ancient, why not? And one thing that often comes up in that kind of broad education is you see things like the Romans taking Egyptian gods, but you don't hear so much about the Egyptians kind of adopting gods from other places. So that's really, really cool. Was Anat's worship limited geographically in Egypt, or do you find evidence throughout the region?
So I do want to stress that while I am head deep in the Anat material, there is not that much material. There are about 80 examples. I'm making basically a catalog of all known examples from her earliest appearance to the end of the New Kingdom. And this is roughly 80 objects. Okay. These 80 objects and 80 examples are basically the only known attestations we have. And they do range very broadly from the Nile Delta, so right where the Nile meets the Mediterranean, all the way down into the Egyptian fortresses that they used to have alongside Nubia, which is modern day Sudan. So it is found quite throughout Egypt. There is a bit of a emphasis on the Theban region, so roughly in Middle Egypt. There is actually a emphasis on that area, but as far as the sheer quantity of information, I wouldn't say, she's not somebody that every single Egyptian person knew and worshipped. She was selected. She did make it into the royal pantheon, which I think is very interesting, but that's a whole nother other story. So,
thank you. And when you're looking at these objects, what kinds of things are we talking about?
We're talking about a lot of things. We're talking about door jambs where Anat may have been written. We're talking about potential temples to Anat. The capital of Egypt during the time of Ramses II, Pi Ramses, whose objects were later moved to Tanis. Supposedly, there was actually a temple of Anat, along with other Near Eastern deities, that was set up there. We're talking about personal names. So I have an entire chapter dealing with Egyptians or people of questionable background who may have had Anat as their name for various reasons. We have people named son of Anat, daughter of Anat, maidservant of Anat. Anat is victorious. We also have, scarabs. The earliest examples come from scarabs, the very small rulers, probably of the 12th dynasty or second intermediate period. It's a wide variety of information. I'd say the largest category that we have at the moment speaking about Anat is papyri.
Okay. That's really interesting. Is there does it seem as though there's a like a social element to this? Is it restricted to elite people, or do you see it throughout? And I'm asking these questions. I know that you haven't finished your research yet, so if these are questions that haven't been answered yet, please just go ahead and say I'm kind of springing this on you.
It's fine. So I am a long-term doctoral student. I am in my 5th year at the moment. I'm still quite a lot to go, but everything that I've done has been really fruitful to now, I can happily say. And I do have answers to your questions because I recently wrote that chapter.
Excellent timing.
So, according to previous researchers, Anat was mainly worshipped by the elite, by the pharaoh himself. Ramses II, he had a daughter named Bint Anat, which means daughter of Anat. Ramses II was also known to take foreign wives in his court, so that could have some kind of link to that. He had a dog named after Anat. He had a sword named after Anat. Seti I had a chariot span named after Anat. So previous scholars have really taken the obvious examples and kind of pushed this narrative that Anat was really limited to the elite. However, when we look at Anat in personal names, so names that the average everyday person has, we actually find some really interesting information that suggests that Anat was at least known in whatever amount to all areas of Egyptian society. Even I think the lowest rank is a very difficult term, of course, when you're talking about the ancient world, but we do actually have records of an Egyptian farmer named after Anat. We have records of average doctors, we have scribes. So from my research, it really seems like she was appearing, at least in personal names, throughout society.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much. So now I've kind of grilled you, totally uncalled for. Sorry about that. On your research, what are your plans for this summer, and how do you think HAPS will be able to help you with the funding?
So, like I said, I am a long-term researcher, a long-term doctorate student. What that actually means is that I am an unfunded doctorate student who is currently working part-time at a Starbucks in order to fund my research. I do have a small scholarship from a very nice Jewish foundation here in Basel that is ending, I believe, June or July. And basically what I would like to do with the HAPS money, if awarded, is to continue my research on my catalog, to finish the database basically of every single Anat object that we have found in Egypt up until the end of the New Kingdom in 1069 BCE, because this will be the very first complete database, very first complete published catalog of every single object known. This, of course, takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of research. It takes a lot of me looking up all sorts of things in languages that I'm not necessarily fluent in, but I'm working on. But the idea really is to be able to use this money to spend more time researching and less time behind the bar making frappuccinos for people.
Which is exactly why we offer the money, because your research is, to me personally, much more interesting and much more important than working in Starbucks. And presumably it's what you'd prefer to be doing also. So we're going to go to the chat and see if people have questions for you. And we have one from Jim. He is asking if Anat remained as popular in Egypt after the Hyksos were expelled.
So I assume when we're talking about the Hyksos being expelled, that we're talking about the end of the Second Intermediate Period, early New Kingdom. And actually, we have very little evidence of Anat from the Second Intermediate Period. There are only 2 pieces of evidence that we have. Both of them are scarabs of people named Aper Anati and Aper Her. Both seem to have been small, either noblemen or like local provincial rulers. But actually, the majority of information we have about Anat is from after the so-called Hyksos being expelled. And it should very clearly be stated that even at the end of the second intermediate period, saying that the Hyksos were expelled, they were expelled from the government. That doesn't mean that all of the people who were living there, who had families there, who were merchants, who were scribes, anyone who had worked there prior, that doesn't necessarily mean that they went back to the Near East. So it's very difficult at the moment to trace Anat's the full scale of Anat's representation within the second intermediate period, but at least from the evidence, the majority of it comes actually from later.
Fascinating, thank you. And when so this is my question because I'm waiting for everybody in the audience to come up with their own. When we're looking at things like cultural contact and the transmission of gods, what kind of social interactions do you imagine gave rise to this kind of movement of deities?
Well, there's a lot of things. I mean, if we're looking at the Near Eastern migrants themselves, I've been looking a lot at anthropological theories of cultural translation, of cultural heritage. And so you have these questions of, you know, when people move to a new place, what are the core things that link them back to their homeland, that make them feel part of a community? Was Anat maybe a means of remaining and keeping a connection to that Near Eastern heritage while in a new land? We also have to think about cultural translation, Egyptian people meeting a merchant or a scribe or whoever from the Near East, having, you know, sitting down over lunch or something, talking about what they believe in, and suddenly realizing, hey, this god isn't so different from my own, or this goddess isn't so different from my own. How can I understand that in my own way? And that actually becomes very interesting because there are quite a few comparison studies that suggest that Anat was seen kind of in relation to the Egyptian goddess Hathor, who also had this warrior type, but also motherly role. That's something I hadn't mentioned before. While in Egypt, Anat actually gained some new roles that weren't in the Near East. One of them being this kind of motherly role. She becomes the mother of the pharaoh. Ramses II and other pharaohs are always talking about how they were nursed by her, how they were her child. And that has really remarkable parallels to Hathor.
That was actually going to be my next question, if she kind of syncretized to other Egyptian deities during her time in Egypt. That's very interesting. So I know that your research ends in the New Kingdom. Do you see towards the end of that period a decrease in Anat, or does it look like her worship continues past your own research interest area?
So Anat was always very closely associated with Astarte, who's another Near Eastern goddess. They were linked in the Near East and they were linked within Egypt. And so in this way, Anat and Astarte continued on after the Egyptian New Kingdom. Mostly the information that we have is of Astarte, but a lot of times if you actually look at the evidence itself, you'll notice that scholars are making their best guess and that it's not actually 100% clear, at least in representations, whether we're talking about Anat or whether we're talking about Astarte. So I would definitely argue that Anat's worship had continued on into Greco-Roman Egypt even, but in what kind of form, it's hard to say because of how similar she is to other goddesses.
Thank you very much. And we have time for one more question before we let Jacqueline go. So Matt is asking, what got you interested in this subject? So I assume by that he means Anat specifically rather than Egyptology.
Sure. Well, I have always been really interested in cultural interactions and how different cultures understand themselves in relation to other people. Originally, I was actually a food specialist. I was looking really at the cultural interactions that surrounded food and food consumption. But this led my master's down the road of actually looking more at, I was using basically pottery from the Egyptian fortresses on the Nubian border. So again, in modern day Sudan, to understand how the Egyptian people were interacting with local Nubian populations at these fortresses. And that during the course of that research, I kind of realized that my real interest wasn't so much in the food, it was in the social interaction surrounding that. And then I began researching, how can I explore this kind of cultural context study further? And I heard about these 6 gods that were entered into Egypt during the late Bronze Age, and I realized there's actually quite a lot of research that hasn't been done, simply because some research is outdated, because people haven't considered personal names, for instance, because people didn't necessarily, the previous writers hadn't gone so much into the anthropological background. There tends to be a lot of research on Anat as far as what she looked like and what she appeared as in texts, but not so much on what she actually meant to the people. And it's hard because you can never say this is what an Egyptian person thought of Anat. You just can't. And you can't say this person was using Anat as a means of maintaining contact to the past. But these kinds of questions are really important to be brought up to remind ourselves that these people from the past aren't so different from people today. And so the more I thought about that, the more I realized that this was a topic that needed to be discussed, especially with the whole question of growing globalism and things like that today. And Basel was the perfect place for it. So that's how that goes together.
Thank you so much. That's a really fascinating answer. I'd love hearing about people's research and how they came to it. And we are officially out of time. So Jacqueline, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Good luck with your dissertation, and we will be in touch shortly.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And that was Jacqueline, everybody. Thank you for those who joined us live today. It was lovely to see you all virtually. Thank you for bringing your questions and your kind attention to our applicants. I will be back Sarah will be back. We have the lovely Sarah Moore to do this afternoon's interviews at 5 p.m. EDT. And I will be back tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. So please join us, come see all of our Egyptology students, have fun, and have a lovely Sunday. Thank you, everybody.